Hello everyone. This is Thomas Blusewitz, a professor at the School of Advanced Studies, a professor of history. Before I will talk about World War II today, I guess maybe we will wait a few minutes to give people more time to join. I hope everyone can see me and hear me all right. Okay. Thank you, Shachlo, for helping us organize this event. I'm very honored to be able to talk to you via Instagram. If someone told me 3 years ago when I was a doctoral student at Harvard that I would be presenting my views on Instagram, I would never believe that. But the world is changing. Well, if someone told me 2 months ago that I would not be able to return to Russia, I would also not believe that. But unfortunately, the world is in a situation it is right now, and we have to deal with that. But thanks to this situation, maybe we have this opportunity to meet on Instagram and talk about World War II and its outcomes. Okay, maybe I'll just give 2 more minutes. I see people are joining, so thank you for joining, by the way, and if you have any questions, if any questions arise as I am talking, of course you can post them here or send them on Instagram, and our administration will direct these questions to you. So I guess I will maybe present my perspective on World War II and its outcomes, and then maybe we'll have 15 minutes for your questions. So I guess we can begin, right? So I would like to say a few words why I decided to talk about this particular issue. First of all, this year we are commemorating and celebrating the 75th anniversary of Allied victory over fascism in World War II. But unfortunately, due to the coronavirus, we will not have the victory parade in Moscow, unfortunately. Unfortunately, you cannot stream this parade in Instagram yet. Maybe one day. So unfortunately, this event will have to be cancelled. The president of Russia said that обязательно, значит, certainly the parade will take place this year, but it will not take place on May the 9th. So I would like to answer this question today. Who really won in World War II? Because it might seem to you as a pretty simple question, I guess, maybe a question you would ask a 4th grader, right? The answer is simple. Well, the Allied powers, the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom, the fascist powers were defeated, Japan, Germany, Italy. So, of course, it's beyond doubt that the military outcome of 1945 was what it was. Everyone knows what the military result of the war was. So no one's questioning that, right? What we want to talk about today is really, as historians say sometimes, who won the peace. So as you know, it's one thing to move your soldiers, right, to make your soldiers get from Moscow or Stalingrad to Berlin, right? Another thing is to negotiate with your allies and with well, there were no negotiations with Nazi Germany, but mostly negotiate with your allies, so that the 3 main allies, as everyone knows, the big 3 as they are known, the Grand Alliance of World War II was the United States, Great Britain, of course, and the Soviet Union. There were other forces involved, of course, as the French resistance, for example, the Free French, of course, China, and especially today I would like to talk about East Asia. So what I want to talk about is not so much 1945, but the peace settlements that were negotiated first in Yalta in February 1945, and then in Potsdam in August in Germany in 1945. So as you know, the big 3 of World War II, where, of course, Josip Vissarionovich Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who were then, by the end of the war, replaced by other leaders, but essentially these three leaders. So we have these three powers who are clearly the winners, militarily speaking, of World War II, right? But what I want to talk about today is how the world looks like 75 years later. Because let's just look at the simple fact of what Russia is today. I mean, first of all, of course, there's no Soviet Union anymore, right? But let's just, for simplicity, assume that Russia is the inheritor of the successor state of the Soviet Union. So the border of Russia today is more or less where the military front was in 1942, right? I mean, the border between Ukraine and Russia is where the Germans were in 1942-43, right? So let's think about the world today, okay? And let's look at various participants of World War II, okay? And see where they are today and how they, so to speak, consume the fruits of victory, or how they secure their objectives through the settlement that was established in 1945 that soon turned into a Cold War confrontation, right? So sometimes historians speak of the Yalta на русском, конечно, англичане не умеют правильно произносить названия русских городов, значит, Yalta World Order, да, либо там post-war world order survived more or less intact until 1990 or 91, depending how you look at it, right? In China, still the Communist Party is in power, right? So what I will tell you today is who definitely did not win World War II. Let's start with this, because it's always an easier kind of answer to give. Who did not, or what did not happen? Who's not happy with the outcomes of World War II? So the most defeated countries, of course, were Germany and Japan, right? Where are these countries today? These countries today are accordingly the third and fourth biggest economies in the world after the US and China and India, depending on how you count it. But Japan and Germany today, by all international measures, are among the most well-developed, safest countries in the world. Okay, we are talking about the world before the coronavirus, but even with the coronavirus, it's actually pretty, as I was thinking about it, it's very telling that by all international measures and what the experts are saying, Germany has the lowest death rate from coronavirus, okay? So it's by all means, and Japan as well, these countries, even though they were in ruins in 1945, right? They are not, well, first of all, they exist and they are doing pretty well, thank you very much. So how did that happen, actually? How is that possible? Especially if you look at Germany. Germany, of course, was divided after World War II, and for 40 years it was a divided country. And here is my first answer to the question. West Germany won in the long run, and East Germany, so the former Soviet occupation zone, the area around Berlin, today is one of the most problematic areas in Europe. So if you look at Germany today, it's an extremely unequal country where there is an extreme level of welfare and security in the West and a very high level of dissatisfaction in the East. So even within one nation, even within one defeated nation, we have clear winners and clear losers. I should also mention that a big part of Germany fell into Poland. So it's also a kind of an unusual type of outcome. But if you move from any East German city today, for example, Leipzig or Dresden, to any Western city like Munich, it's like traveling from Ryazan to Moscow. I mean, the difference in living standards is just enormous. So West Germans won by the sheer fact that by sheer luck of finding themselves in the American-British occupied zone. While the East Germans, who got into the Soviet zone, they are today one of the most unhappy people in the world by all measures, because they feel, well, that they had terrible luck, because their, so to say, compatriots in the other country are living a much better life. Okay, another country that was divided after World War II is Korea. And Korea technically was among the winners of World War II, because this nation was resisting Japanese aggression. I mean, there was no state of Korea before World War II, but the Korean nation, we can say, was among, well, the Allied nations who fought with fascism, because they fought Japanese. They stood up against Japanese aggression. And again, like with Germany, the northern part of the country got into the communist sphere of influence, and the southern part of the country got into Western sphere of influence. And well, I don't have to give you evidence, I hope, to convince you that North Korea today is one of the well, it's one of the most brutal dictatorships in the world, right? While South Korea is, again, by all measures, among certainly top 10 most developed countries in the world. So I wanted to give you these two examples just to illustrate that the outcomes of World War II, to really see them and to really see where nations and people and governments are, it's not enough to look at 1945, okay? We have to look at the entire trajectory. And sometimes these outcomes were they depended on sheer luck in some respect. They just depended on whether you were located geographically in the south or the north, whether you were placed like Poland between Germany and the Soviet Union, or if you were placed like Norway between Denmark and Sweden. Right, so Norway was also an occupied country, and so was Holland and Belgium and so on and so forth. Okay, so these are some of the paradoxes I wanted to point out, especially if we look at Germany and Japan. Even though these powers were defeated, already in the 1960s, 70s, these were the fastest developing countries in the world, with objectively the highest living standard, life expectancy, education, right? Okay, so let's now look at the big three, okay, because these are the main, so to speak, victors, right? So let's look at Great Britain. Great Britain in 1939 was still the largest empire in the world, territorially, in terms of population, and by 1960, pretty much Great Britain lost all of its empire because of national liberation movements, because of Gandhi, because of Nasser in Egypt. People had enough of colonial European rule. The same conclusion applies to France, right? France was also among the victors of World War II. Also, it lost most of its empire. And actually, it didn't lose its empire, it didn't give up its empire for free. Actually, before Vietnam was invaded by the Americans and the Chinese from the north, the French fought for many years to keep that colony. So Britain and France, who in 1938 were the two leading powers in the world, countries that run the League of Nations and actually decided world affairs, because America was in isolation, Moscow was kind of, a communist country in a league of its own. So America and Russia were kind of out of international relations. So these two countries, even though technically they were among the victors, they lose their influence in the world to a tremendous degree. And all that Winston Churchill fought for, So keeping the British Empire intact was actually something he failed to realize, to implement. And a symbolic indication of that failure was Churchill's dismissal from his post of Prime Minister in July 1945. So it's actually an interesting episode where in 1945, in July, the war in Europe is over, right? Stalin, Churchill, and Franklin Roosevelt died in April. His successor, Harry Truman, they come to Berlin. Stalin comes by train, by the way. He's late one day. But so he's late, and already one day after the conference starts, like the conference that was supposed to decide the future of the world, the conference during which the Americans told Stalin that they invented the nuclear bomb, right? That they tested, they conducted the first successful test of nuclear weapons. So this was an event that, well, that shaped the future of the world for the next 70 years, right? The invention of nuclear weapons. So during that momentous moment, Churchill gets news from home that he lost elections to the Labour Party, which was an enormous, enormously heavy burden for Churchill, because he was the man who actually, historians agree, had a tremendous influence in helping Britain win the war. So the guy who makes sure Britain wins the war actually is dismissed by his voters from office, right? And Stalin made numerous jokes about it. He said, like, so I know you have elections in your country, but how can you actually lose elections? Because it was unthinkable for Stalin that a leader, especially a leader like Churchill, who had an enormous authority among a lot of people, right? And who's seen today as one of the greatest leaders in history, right? He was voted in the elections, voted out of his office, right? And this is a very symbolic thing, a symbolic representation of what happens to Britain and its influence. And I think my personal opinion is that what we see with Brexit today and the whole decline of British political life, I can't call it otherwise, is still a part of this process during which Britain, even though it was a victor during World War II, suffers a decline. Why does it suffer a decline? Mostly because the British economy is not able to sustain anymore the horrendous investments and resources that had to be invested in the war effort. And Britain is actually in an economic stagnation. It's losing its empire, and it's in a bad place. So we face this paradox, right? That Churchill's out, Britain's kind of on the sidelines of world politics. Most people would say that if there is one politician who decides how affairs are run in Europe, it's Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany. So we have this paradoxical outcome. Now I want to talk a little bit about your country, the Soviet Union, or Russia today. Most of our listeners probably were born already in Russia, so you were born in a country that theoretically, from a legal point of view, did not participate in World War II, right? The country that did participate and country that did liberate and storm Berlin does not exist anymore. So that's another paradox, of course. Well, let's assume that Russia is a successor, right? So Russia is smaller today than the Soviet Union was in 1938 by all standards. It's smaller by territory. It's still the largest country in the world, of course, but it has lost some of its centers. It has lost Kiev. It has lost Donbass, of course, the consequence of which we are still living through. Russia has lost Crimea, of course, which it has regained, as we all know. So, well, what we see in Donbass and Crimea is a kind of some analysts would say, an attempt to at least partially regain Soviet positions that were lost by consequence of the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? So Russia is smaller in terms of population. The population of the Soviet Union was nearly 200 million. Russia today is 145 and it's declining. The share of Russia's economy in the world today is between 1 and 3%, depending how you count it. The Soviet industrial output was much larger. So how did this happen? That actually the country that, and most historians, when they look at 1945, they look at what was negotiated between Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill. They say the Soviets got the best deal. They say because the Soviets got all of Eastern Europe. They got all these satellites like Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, so on and so forth, where they could do whatever they want. The Western powers would not intervene, right? So in 1950, it seems like communism is spreading everywhere, right? We have communism in China, we have communism in Eastern Europe, we have communism in Germany, in East Germany. We have very powerful communist countries in France and Italy, right? So from that enormous sphere of influence, which was seen as Stalin's personal success in successfully negotiating the peace treaties, right? Half of Europe went into the Soviet sphere. Also, the Soviets regained what Russia lost during the wars with Japan in 1905. So Kuril Islands and Sakhalin and some territories in the Far East. So it seemed like Stalin secured a great peace treaty. So what happened, right? How do we get from that situation to where Russia is in the 1990s? And we don't have much time to go into that. By my answer to the question is, Russia lost World War II, or Russian people, let's say the Soviet Union and peoples of the Soviet Union, because communism won. And because the war helped Stalin actually to achieve an enormous level of totalitarian dictatorial control by 1946 that was unprecedented in the world. So the Soviet Union of 1950 is Stalin's personal, so to say, playground, the same way it was in 1937 or 38. And it did not seem this way, because if you look at what's going on in for example, in Moscow in 1941 in October, it seemed like the Soviet regime, the Bolsheviks as they were called, they were about to collapse. But they did not, and Stalin was able to secure and strengthen his own system, right? So what really won in World War II was not so much the Russian people, because the Russian and other Soviet peoples lost 27 million people, right? By the way, sometimes when I see in Russia these bumper stickers on car, 1945, можем повторить, we can repeat it, I always scratch my head, because, well, what kind of victory was it for the Soviet people, right? There's an enormous, unthinkable cost in resources. And the Soviet Union was a devastated country after the war, a country in which Stalin's rule was absolute, and Stalin did not change a single bit. After the war, he continued with his purges, he continued with his terror. Things got even worse. So what won was really Stalin's system, Stalin's Red Army. I think my personal opinion is that peoples of the Soviet Union, they actually, well, they had to live in this system that eventually collapsed in 89, 91. And I think Soviet people were not really the victors. It was just the very narrow elite of the communist system who actually were able to benefit because of that victory, right? So, of course, it's a controversial view. Some people disagree with this, but this is my view, right? I think that communism was a bad system, and because it was a good system for war, of course, because it was able to mobilize people and force people to die at the front in numbers unthinkable in a democracy, right? 27 million people compared to 500,000 Americans. And let's not forget that the Americans also fought Japan. So it was a victory for that system, right? That system that collapsed. And I think that Russian people can begin to develop more or less normally after the collapse of that system. Okay, so that's Russia. I have maybe 5-10 minutes left, so I want to point your attention to a region that most people usually don't think about that much when they think about World War II, because everyone's focused, of course, on Germany, on Berlin, on Eastern Europe. But the place that really matters today for the world in terms of global outcomes is actually the Far East, and especially China. And most people don't understand at all what position is China in during World War II, because it's a pretty, especially in the West, but I think in Russia most people don't even understand what was going on in China at that time. So I don't have much time, but I will briefly summarize that China was granted, together with the UK, the USSR, France, and the UK, right? Five powers of the Security Council of the UN, of the United Nations, right? So we have five great powers who have a veto power in the UN today. And China is one of them. How did that happen, right? Because China in 1945 is still a country that is occupied 70% of its, not so much territory, but 70% of Chinese people live under Japanese occupation, okay? Then the Americans drop the atomic bomb, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan, and Japan surrenders a month later. And the Japanese army moves out of China, okay? So what happens in China then is a continuation of the Civil War. So let's not forget that before Japan invades China, which is 1937, and actually we should consider this as the real beginning of World War II, not 39 or especially not 41. When Japan invades China in July 1937, there is a civil war between communists and nationalists happening in China at that time, right? And when the Japanese surrender, that civil war actually restarts. And what most people don't understand is that 99% of observers were absolutely sure that the nationalists under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek were certainly going to defeat the communists, because this is how it looked on the ground, if you look at the number of troops and so on and so forth. And especially because it was actually America who supported the nationalists very much. And America invests a lot of resources into helping the nationalists secure power in China. And what happens? Well, they are defeated in 1949, right? And they have to move out to escape to Taiwan. Okay, so let's not forget about these two places, Taiwan and China, right? Taiwan today is like kind of Japan, right? It's a place where the standard of living is very high, where life expectancy, for example, is also very long, while communist China is, well, now we can start a discussion, but of course it's a second superpower today in the world, but it's still a communist system, right? And now we face a very interesting kind of a situation with China, where the communists, who were actually not the leading kind of force who resisted the Japanese during World War II, the communists are actually in power. So communists win power in China, and they secure the continuation of the communist system. Now, of course, life in China today is much better than it was in the 1960s under Mao, right? So China begins to develop slightly better in the 1980s because they actually, well, they remain communist in politics, but economically they are more or less capitalist, right? But until then, life in China was extremely miserable, right? So China here is this kind of mixed bag where we have, right, a horrible situation in the 1960s when the Cultural Revolution happened. You had an enormous famine incomparable to anything that we know in Russia. You had the Cultural Revolution, where millions and millions of people died because of political violence. So even though China is theoretically among the victors, right, it suffers a very horrendous fate after World War II. If you ask me, would I like to live, for example, in Frankfurt or let's say in Tokyo, so defeated nations of World War II, or would I like to live in Beijing in the 1930s, I would certainly pick Tokyo or Frankfurt, right? Because your chances of getting killed in China are extremely high. Right, so I guess I have just a few minutes left. Maybe, if anything I said seems controversial to you, or you would like to know more details, please ask them and send them to me. I would be very happy to answer them. Just a few more words about other nations, right? Because let's not forget that World War II was a conflict in which pretty much all nations participated, apart from Africa, most of Africa and South America. Let's not forget that other nations also had a very difficult and very divergent fates after World War II, so to say. For example, my own country, Poland, right? It was a country that theoretically was on the winning side, right? It was among the theoretically, it was among the victors of World War II, of course. Poles stormed Berlin together with the Russians, Ukrainians, and so on. So Poland actually loses territory during World War II because it's moved by Stalin west, okay? But on the other hand, Poland wins territories that were very well developed, like German Silesia, okay? So when we look at 1945, really, again, I would like to emphasize this. It's important always to look at the long-term trajectories and especially look at economic development, because in the long run, it's economic development that secures well-being and prosperity of nations. It's not so much particular military outcomes, right? It's mostly good institutions and good development, right? Okay, so I would like to summarize that most people, most nations lost in the result of World War II. Let's not forget about 50 or 70 million people who lost their lives. And people lost their lives and became disabled and sick and poor in all countries, not just defeated countries or winning countries. Most nations were in a poor situation, and it took many, many years to actually rebuild countries and secure a new conditions for development. One exception to this rule is, of course, the United States. And my final word today will be about the United States, who, in my opinion, emerges as the only clear winner by all measurements in this situation, right? Because the Soviet Union, again, ceases to exist. It collapses because of the communist system and its internal contradictions. The United States, after World War II, experiences half a century of unprecedented prosperity and growth in human history. And this was a result of a very clever strategy that the United States took during World War II and the combination of proper institutions and good economic development. But the United States, if we look at the influence of that country, of course, I'm not saying anything surprising here, but that is the only clear winner. And the system built by the United States, including the NATO and transatlantic partnership, survives, I think now we can say it, until 2016, when Trump comes to power. And what we see now in America, to my great regret, is unfortunately wasting of a good policy that America had during World War II and in result of the peace treaty. Okay, so I guess I'll stop here. We have 10 minutes and I already see some questions from you. So please, if you have any questions, please ask them because I've been talking to my phone for 35 minutes, so it would be really nice to hear from you what is interesting to you. I see a question, how are you doing during this time? I'm doing, thank you for your concern, I'm doing pretty well. I'm healthy, my family is fine, but I'm stuck in Europe right now. If any one of you has a direct phone call to Vladimir Vladimirovich, please call him and tell him that I need to return, he needs to return me to Tübingen and to SAS as soon as possible, because your education suffers in consequence of my absence, okay? So I'm doing fine, but well, the situation is what it is, as you know. Okay, the second question is, there was a lot of capitalist reforms in China. It's now difficult to call it a communist system. Well, yes, I fully agree. And that's what I said. In the 1980s, under Deng Xiaoping, China undergoes a period of reforms, and that's why it escapes a Soviet fate, because it's able to embrace the kind of institutions and rules of market that allow countries to develop normally, and well, but it still maintains a political system that, well, in my opinion, is a problem. But well, we could see this on the example of the recent outbreak of the COVID-19, which Trump calls the Chinese virus. Of course, you could see why that system is bad, because it's a system that hides information from its people, that is not transparent. It's a system that manipulates people. It's a system that, does not allow for a free flow of information. And in a situation like we have with the virus right now, without a clear flow, honest flow of information, we can be in big trouble. So we'll see what's going to happen with China. If you ask me today, would I like to live in Germany, China, or Japan, I would pick Germany and Japan any day. Okay, I see Shachlo is writing the next question. How to survive in isolation. We do not allow questions not related to the topic. At isolation, I will answer this question by turning it into politics. Isolation is always bad. And that's what the Americans learned in the 1930s. If you know, isolationism was an official policy of the United States between between World War I and World War II, and it did not end well for America, because they were attacked by the Japanese in Pearl Harbor, right? So we all know that. Isolation in the current global world, we'll see how long isolation can last, but right now, if you look at the world economy, we can see that any attempt to actually close the border and isolate economies from each other and flow of people, goods, it has a horrible impact. I mean, it has the worst. What we see right now in the economic world is the worst collapse of markets in human history. And I hope politicians will be able to understand this. They understand this very well. That's why, even though we don't have a vaccine and we don't have any real medicine against the virus, I think, right? We, at least in Europe, are opening the borders again and letting people move and trade and go to stores, because the economy can't survive isolation. So isolation is always a bad idea in world politics. How you survive in isolation as a person? Read a history book. I can send you some recommendations. Tomek, what do you think about the current situation? Is World War III, is it a World War III in a perverted version? I don't think we should talk about war until war really starts, a real war like World War II. Of course, we have wars in the world today. Let's not forget about Syria. Let's not forget about Sudan and other places, but these are still very small-scale conflicts compared to World War II. Um, if I should make a prediction, I think that the political consequences of the current crisis in international relations will be extremely severe. I think China will get in trouble. I think China will have a hard time explaining what actually happened and where this virus comes from and how it actually came to be. Because even if it comes from natural sources, it's still not a good thing if you have these things like live animal markets. It's still a bad thing from all points of view, sanitary reasons, cultural reasons, any reasons. If it turns out that the Chinese made this virus in a laboratory and either by accident or on purpose let it out from the laboratory, that's bad. And I think you can already see, especially in America, because I think the Americans right now are the only people who are not really yet scared of the Chinese, like the way Europeans are, or even the Russians. They try to be very nice and cute with the Chinese. The American public opinion right now, as I see it, is extremely pissed off, excuse my language, and is looking for answers about who on earth allowed this situation to happen. And I think even if China is not to blame, you can already see Donald Trump and most right-wing politicians in America saying China is to blame and we have to punish them big time. We have to do something about it. We can't allow this to go without our response. So I predict an extreme sharpening of tensions between China and America, and we'll see where countries will position themselves in that conflict. And I very much sincerely hope that Russia will position itself still with the Western world, not with the Chinese. Okay, so now what about new countries that appeared on the map after World War II? Which countries? Like, there aren't that many that appear. Any major countries that I can think about? Well, there are new political systems in most countries, like in Italy or Germany. Maybe I'm missing something. Of course, then we have a wave of decolonization, but that's not a direct consequence of World War II. So maybe if you can specify which country you mean after World War II. Okay, what do you think about modern issues between Russia and the West? Are these unresolved disputes after World War II? A very good question. And I would say mostly no. Mostly the disputes that we see between Russia and the West today are a consequence of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the unresolved issues between various republics of the Union, including Ukraine and Russia, right? The conflict that we see right now between Ukrainians and Russians and all that we see in Donbass has nothing to do with World War II, but it has everything to do with the Soviet system and how bad that system was. And if we did not have communism, we would not have this conflict. So let's not forget that there was Nikita Khrushchev who decided to move Crimea to Ukraine for no reason. But this was exactly the wicked nature of the system, that you can just move one territory that's all populated by Russians to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic for no reason, right? So no, I think that the conflict with the West and Russia today has to do with the fact that the former Soviet nations can't really still solve their own issues between themselves, and that applies to Baltic states and Russia. Let's not forget that these are also former Soviet republics. Do you think that the current economic crisis is worse than the Great Depression? I have just 1 minute, so I will answer. From what it looks like right now, the unemployment figures in America, around 25 million people. We have never ever seen anything like that in history. price of oil dropping to -40. I just hope that the economy will rebound as quickly as as soon as the virus disappears, because there are no reasons for the economy to be in crisis, really. So, yes, this crisis that we have right now is extremely sharp, is unprecedented, is completely unrecorded in history. So we don't even have anything to compare it with. But my hope is that it will get resolved as quickly as it appeared, as soon as we either know how to cure this virus or figure something out. So our time is up, unfortunately, so I would like to thank everyone who joined us today. I wish you good health, and I very much do hope see all of you in Tumin or elsewhere very soon, actually in person. So thank you very much. My best wishes to all of you and your families. Stay safe and see you soon. Bye-bye.